They say power reveals a person's true character. In some neighborhoods, that power comes wearing a name tag and clutching a clipboard. I never expected my peaceful life to be shaken by a self-appointed queen of an HOA. I never even agreed to join. But that's exactly what happened. What started as a simple backyard barbecue turned into a battle for control, pride, and ownership itself. Sometimes the ones who bark the loudest forget to check who actually owns the yard they're barking in. And in Willow Creek Estates, one woman was about to learn that lesson the hard way. This isn't just a story about rules. It's a story about standing your ground, about community, about knowing when to smile and when to strike back. They say some people move into a neighborhood and think they're royalty. Patricia Coleman was exactly that type, freshly elected as the president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, and already wielding her clipboard like a scepter. Me. I'm Daniel Brooks, private hardworking and definitely not someone who needed the HOA's approval to live my life. Because, well, I owned the land under their feet, literally, not that Patricia knew that. It was a warm Saturday evening when everything started. I had decided to host a small barbecue. Nothing wild, just a gathering of 15 friends, a few beers, some music floating gently through the air, laughter filled the backyard. Kids chased each other on the lawn, and for once, after years of quietly blending into the neighborhood, I felt like celebrating. That's when she arrived. I spotted her at the edge of the yard, arms folded, mouth pinched so tightly it could have cracked a walnut. Patricia didn't knock. She didn't even call. She marched across the grass as if she owned the place. Without so much as a hello, she started firing off accusations. "This gathering," she said, voice dripping with disdain, "is in violation of HOA guidelines. No outdoor events exceeding 10 people without prior approval. Noise complaints are already piling up." I glanced around. The music was soft enough not to disturb even the most sensitive neighbor. My friends weren't drunkenly howling or tossing beer cans on the lawn. The only disturbance here was her. "I'm sorry," I said casually, "but I'm not a member of the HOA." Patricia's face twisted like I'd insulted her bloodline. "That doesn't matter. All properties within Willow Creek Estates fall under HOA jurisdiction. If you refuse to comply, we will start proceedings to have you removed from the premises." Removed from my own house. I almost laughed. Instead, I sipped my drink and nodded, as if considering her ultimatum seriously. "Is that right?" I said, smiling faintly. Patricia clearly mistook my calmness for fear. She straightened her blazer, emboldened. "You'll be receiving a formal violation notice on Monday. Continued non-compliance could result in fines, legal action, and eventual eviction. We will protect the character of our community." I watched her for a moment. The way she stood there, chest puffed out, believing herself untouchable. It wasn't arrogance born from malice. It was ignorance wrapped in a tight little package of power hunger. And she had no idea just how badly she had misjudged her opponent. See, when Willow Creek Estates was developed 15 years ago, I had quietly bought the land and leased it out to the builders. Every home, every street, even the community center where the HOA held its meetings, it all sat on my property. I rarely interfered. People wanted their little rules and monthly newsletters. Fine. As long as the checks cleared and nobody caused trouble, I was happy to stay in the background. But Patricia had crossed a line tonight, not just by insulting me at my own home, but by threatening something far more sacred, my right to live peacefully. I looked her square in the eye. "Patricia," I said quietly, "be very careful about the battles you choose." She scoffed clearly, believing she had won. "Consider this your final warning, Mr. Brooks." Then she turned sharply on her heel and stormed away, already pulling out her phone, probably calling an emergency board meeting to discuss dealing with the troublemaker. I stayed there on the patio, watching the sun sink low behind the trees, feeling the weight of the decision settle in. This wasn't just a personal attack anymore. It was a challenge to everything I stood for: fairness, privacy, and respect. Patricia had no idea what kind of fight she had just picked. And for the first time in a long time, I realized maybe it was time. I reminded this neighborhood exactly who really ran Willow Creek Estates. Not with shouting, not with empty threats, but with the kind of power that speaks quietly and hits like a hammer when necessary. The stage was set. The players were in motion, and Patricia. She had just volunteered for the leading role in her own downfall. The next morning, Willow Creek Estates was buzzing like a kicked beehive. I found a bright red violation notice duct taped to my front door. Bold letters screamed, "Notice of non-compliance. Immediate action required." Was below it a list of absurd accusations: unauthorized, event excessive noise, illegal parking of guest vehicles, and, laughably, behavior disruptive to community values. At the bottom, in overly formal script, a summons, mandatory appearance. Before the HOA board, Thursday, 6 p.m. I smiled. Patricia wasn't just poking the bear anymore. She had waltzed into the bear's cave and started whacking pots and pans. I decided to play along. All week, I kept things quiet. I mowed my lawn meticulously, trimmed the hedges, even repainted my mailbox, just to eliminate any petty ammunition. Meanwhile, I made a few calls of my own. To my attorney, to my property management company, and to the city planning department, just for fun. By Thursday evening, I walked into the community center, technically my building, in jeans and a polo, carrying a leather folder under my arm. Inside, the hearing had all the makings of a bad courtroom drama. Patricia sat at the center of a long table, flanked by 4 other board members, all wearing identical tight expressions like they'd rehearsed their indignation in the mirror. A dozen curious residents sat in folding chairs, whispering and glancing nervously. The moment I stepped in, the whispers intensified. Patricia banged a tiny gavel like she was presiding over a Supreme Court session. "Mr. Brooks," she said without hiding her disdain, "you have been summoned to respond to charges of repeated violations of community guidelines, endangerment of neighborhood harmony, and failure to comply with the Willow Creek Estates Code of Conduct." I raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Let her dig deeper. She leaned forward. "How do you plead to these violations?" I placed the leather folder gently on the table. "Before we get into all that," I said calmly, "I have a few preliminary questions." Patricia blinked, clearly thrown off script. "This is highly irregular." "Humor me," I said, smiling faintly. "First, who owns this building?" There was a long, awkward pause. One board member, a younger guy named Vince, frowned and started shuffling through his papers. Patricia cleared her throat. "The HOA leases the building from the Willow Creek Land Corporation." "And who owns the Willow Creek Land Corporation?" I asked, my voice soft but deliberate. More shuffling, more uncomfortable glances. "I do," I said simply, flipping open my folder and pulling out a neatly notarized document. The full ownership record, property maps, and corporate registration papers. The room went dead silent. Patricia paled. I continued, voice steady. "Which means you, the HOA, pay rent to my corporation to hold meetings here. And which also means the land under every house in this neighborhood also mine." A woman in the audience gasped. "And just to clarify," I added, "as landlord, I can terminate that lease with 30 days' notice." Patricia opened her mouth, but no words came out. "And while we're at it," I said, pulling out another document, "I contacted the city zoning department. Willow Creek Estates is zoned single-family residential with owner-optional HOA participation. Meaning, by law, membership in the HOA cannot be enforced without a signed agreement." I smiled wider, letting the silence hang heavy. I said, tapping my chest. "Never signed anything." It was Vince who broke the silence first. "Wait, so you're not even in the HOA?" "No," I said cheerfully. "Never have been. Never will be." Murmurs rippled through the room. People turned to each other, whispering furiously. A few residents shot dirty looks at Patricia. But community values," Patricia stammered, "are not legally binding." I finished for her. "They're suggestions, not rules. especially not for non-members. Patricia looked like she might actually faint. I stood, sliding the folder back under my arm. In fact, I said, addressing the room, starting tomorrow, I'll be reviewing all HOA operations to ensure compliance with the terms of your lease agreements and city ordinances. I paused, then added smoothly, "Oh, and unpaid back rents. Those are going to need settling." The board members stared at me in horror. Patricia tried one last desperate move. "You can't do this," she cried, slamming her fist on the table. "You can't just walk in here and own everything," I asked quietly. Funny, because that's exactly what I did. And with that, I walked out of the room, past stunned neighbors, a gaping Patricia, and a future that suddenly looked a whole lot freer for Willow Creek Estates. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. When people like Patricia lose power, they don't just disappear quietly. They come back, more desperate, more dangerous. The real battle was just beginning. It only took 3 days for Patricia to launch her desperate counterattack. I was sipping coffee on my back porch one morning watching the sunrise when my phone buzzed. A neighbor, breathless and panicked, was on the line. "You need to come to the front entrance, now." I pulled on a jacket and headed down the street. What I found made my blood boil. Patricia, flanked by 2 private security guards, had set up a makeshift checkpoint at the entrance to Willow Creek Estates. A handwritten sign taped to a traffic cone read, "Private community, access restricted to HOA members only." Residents were being stopped, interrogated, and even denied entry if they couldn't produce an HOA compliance card. Patricia had apparently whipped up overnight. Cars were backed up, elderly neighbors stood outside their vehicles, confused and frightened. Kids clutched backpacks, unsure if they'd be allowed to go to school. Patricia stood at the checkpoint, clipboard in hand, barking orders like a dictator. Enough was enough. I marched straight up to her. "Patricia," I said calmly, "take that sign down." She turned, her eyes wild with adrenaline. "You don't belong here," she shrieked. "You're a danger to this community." One of the guards, a guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, stepped forward hesitantly. "Ma'am," he muttered to her, "maybe we should—" "No," Patricia snapped. I gave the order, "Block him." I looked at the guards dead in the eye. "You're trespassing on private property," I said, voice low but clear. "I own the land under your feet. You are impeding access to residents. That's illegal detention." One guard shifted uncomfortably. The other looked straight at Patricia. "You didn't tell us that," he said under his breath. Before the situation could get uglier, the police pulled up, blue and red lights cutting through the morning mist. I waved them over. "Officer," I said, "this woman is illegally restricting access to private property. I have ownership records right here." The officer, a tall woman with sharp eyes, took one look at the paperwork and nodded grimly. "Ma'am," she said to Patricia, "you're coming with us right now." Patricia's jaw dropped. "You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president." The officer didn't even blink. "Ma'am, the HOA has no legal jurisdiction to block residents or enforce access restrictions on land they don't own. Step aside or we'll add resisting arrest to the charges." Residents began cheering, literally cheering, as Patricia was handcuffed and led away, still shouting about rules and guidelines no one cared about anymore. The checkpoint was dismantled within minutes. The neighborhood finally breathed again. In the weeks that followed, things moved quickly. Patricia faced charges for unlawful detention, harassment, and impersonation of authority. I formally terminated the HOA lease. Without a headquarters, without credibility, the HOA collapsed almost overnight. The remaining board members resigned quietly, one by one, most issuing public apologies. I hosted a barbecue, a real one this time, and nearly every family came out to celebrate. The old, suffocating tension that had hung over Willow Creek Estates evaporated. Gardens flourished. Kids played freely in the streets again. Neighbors who'd barely spoken started helping each other with home repairs and community projects. Without the HOA, the community actually became a community. As for Patricia, her house sat unsold for months. Eventually, she slinked away in the middle of the night, leaving a for sale sign, leaning awkwardly in her unkempt front yard. I ended up buying the house at auction just because, well, why not? Today, that house is a public community center open to every resident. No rules, no fines, no nonsense. We painted it bright blue, the same shade. Patricia once tried to ban. Every time I walk past it, I smile. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something better, right on top of the ruins of arrogance.